Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome to the Enemies List today the great Scott Galloway. Scott is a brilliant podcaster, brilliant commentator, a guy who understands this economy and our society better than a lot of people, with a really crisp sense of realism. And of course, he is Kara Swisher's better half in many of their ventures.
Says Kara Swisher, yeah.
Right. But anyway, Scott, thank you so much for coming on the Enemies List today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm sincere about this, Rick. I worked out this morning. I'm going to Chiltern Firehouse, which is this kind of cool, edgy hotel tonight.
Love that.
I did a podcast with a senator today. Hands down, when I looked at my calendar, I'm like, okay, yeah, nice. And I'm like, oh, enemies. I'm like, this was the thing I was most excited about.
Well, I appreciate that, man. I really do. So listen, Scott, I want to jump in on this, and folks, this will be a podcast that's less political than we normally are, but I think more interesting in a way. So Scott, right off the bat, I want to ask you, politics is always driven underneath by a lot of economic and social changes. And it feels like the economics and social changes are driving our politics faster than anybody can keep up with it, either from leadership or legislation or anything else. Where do you see us headed and going right now in this in this moment?
It's a thoughtful question. So I think to try and figure out the treatment, you have to diagnose the problem. And if I were to try and, Jim Barksdale from Netscape always said, always be clear to make sure that the main thing stays the main thing. And I think the main thing in the US, the ground zero for if you were to try and figure out what is the blast zone that's causing many or most of our problems, it would be the following stat. And that is, for the first time in our nation's history, a 30-year-old man or woman isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. And that is the ultimate compact any society has with its public. And that is, if I work hard and I'm a good person, my son or daughter will do as well or better than me. And for the first time in 250 years, that's no longer the case. This year, 49% of 30-year-olds aren't making as much on an inflation-adjusted basis as their parents were at 30. That has never happened before. Now, what does that mean? It means they're more likely to live at home. And they're reminded every day of the shame and rage they feel. They're less likely to enter into a romantic relationship because, despite what we would like to think, men who are not economically viable are less attractive to women. And there's less household formation. There's less population growth. I think a lot of men end up retreating from society and losing all hope and faith. Then you have a whole population of Americans who think the system doesn't work, doesn't respect their institutions. The men become more prone to conspiracy theory. And we end up with nationalism, and we end up in sort of a downward spiral of the nation. And what's most tragic about this is that if you look at the macro picture, our GDP growth is, if not remarkable, it's been consistent. Our stock markets have on average 10% a year for the last 10 years. No other G7 nation is close to that.
Right.
And yet the majority of Americans aren't participating in this. The way I would describe us, our economy is incredible prosperity, but it hasn't translated to progress for our society. So the cancer that's fueling the tumors that are metastatizing all over our society is simple. Young people aren't doing as well as their parents.
It is. I mean, that sense of inequality and inequity in the economy is. I mean, look, it wasn't the cause of Trump and Trumpism, but it certainly was a driving force underneath a lot of these people. Even those who were doing well economically felt like somehow they were getting ripped off. The world was broken. The elites were always prospering, and they were always falling behind. I mean, and to a degree, they're not wrong. I mean, there's the wage picture and the inequities of that are widening like by the month. And CEO pay strikes. When you find out that a line worker at GM is making $32 an hour on average, you're not You're not like, oh, this is a glittering economic picture for hardworking middle Americans.
Yeah, and the stats are just overwhelming. The average 70-year-old is 72% wealthier than he or she was 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the average person under the age of 40 is 24% less wealthy. Look at the primary means of sort of wealth creation, because it's forced saving and psychic income, a house, right? That's what we do. We stretch, we buy a house. It's tax advantaged, tax deductible, forced savings. It kind of is a linchpin in committing to someone, monogamy, having kids.
Mm-hmm.
And the average age in 1980 of a home buyer was 29. Today it's 47. I mean, it's just the average home has gone up in price 12-fold. The average income has gone up 6-fold. So housing is twice as expensive as it used to be. So there's tremendous just rage. And the thing that's I find most upsetting about this is the incumbents and the entrenched will pretend that it's things like, they'll blame it on amorphous demons like networking effects or globalization. These were conscious decisions we've made. We've decided that someone like me should pay lower taxes, that older people who get their money from stocks and investments pay a much lower tax rate, and I get a tax deduction for owning a home. Who makes their money from current income and rents? Younger people. So these are conscious decisions to transfer money from younger generations to our generation.
You know, you mentioned just now about how with people like unable to afford a home, unable to feel fully invested and engaged in the economy, you end up with a lot of men and younger men as college has become more female and as women have been integrated into that well over the 50% mark, and it's close to, I think, 65% now of women are women to men in college. I mean, and you've written a lot, and I think it's a compelling set of questions. What should we be doing to help young men and boys actually not only channel all of their energies, but to feel empowered and productive in an affirmative way in our society? Because we know it's broken. We know young men are in a broken situation, and you know, my son is 27 years old. He was raised with with everything he needed, right? But a lot of his friends, even their age, they're not accomplishing what he and some of the others have, and it feels like we are sitting on a powder keg of this lost generation of young men.
It's something I think a lot about. I have 12 and 15-year-old boys, and I mean, there's a few things. The first is we have to, as a society, recognize that empathy is not a zero-sum game. And that because we didn't want to openly talk about the problems men were facing, we didn't want to talk about the fact they're 12 times more likely to be incarcerated, 4 times more likely to kill themselves, 3 times more likely to be addicted, that these unfortunate voices filled the void, which made things worse. Because now anytime you bring up the notion of young men not doing well, people understandably have a gag reflex and think, oh no, it's another thinly veiled misogynist.
Right.
And so the conversation has finally turned productive. And I think people, especially I think the cohort that's moving the needle here is mothers who basically say, I have 2 daughters and a son. One daughter's at Penn, the other daughter's in PR at a firm in Chicago, and my son is in the basement vaping and playing video games.
Right.
I mean, the numbers are just staggering. More single women own homes right now than men, which is great, except if we're going to have an honest conversation around society, we have to have an honest conversation, and that is men are still seen as the economic provider, and women are not attracted to men who don't make as much money as them. The likelihood of divorce doubles when the woman starts making more money than the man. The man is 3 times more likely to need erectile dysfunction drugs when the woman starts making more money than woman. So I hope we get to a point where we're all very, very evolved around this issue, but men are less attractive to women. Women are getting taller and taller metaphorically. 50% of women say they won't date a man shorter than them. It's probably more like 80%. It's a weird thing to admit. And metaphorically, women are getting taller and taller every day, which is wonderful, and there's nothing we should do to stop that.
Sure.
But meanwhile, men are getting shorter and shorter. The reasons for it are biological. Men's prefrontal cortex matures later. They're now saying that men don't catch up to women from an executive function standpoint until their early 30s. It's societal. We hold men accountable. When we talk about the issues facing non-whites and women, we use terms, we talk about societal investment. We talk about the need. We talk about empathy. We talk about that this issue warrants scrutiny, empathy, and investment. When we talk about men failing, we use words like accountability and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps.
Mm-hmm.
We know that all the terrorists in 9/11 were men, but what we don't want to talk about is all 340 firefighters who died rushing into those buildings were also all men.
Yeah.
We don't, whenever we talk about, all men, 90% of men are responsible for the murders. Men are violent. But what we don't talk about is that men who are for example, I just saw the stat that blew me away, Rick. 2 minors, a girl and a boy, sexually abused. The boy is 10 times more likely to commit suicide later in life.
Jesus.
And that's not to say that one crime is less heinous than the other, but what we have found is that while boys are physically stronger, girls are emotionally and mentally stronger. And the singular point of failure, and I'll use this as a segue to solutions. If you could point to a singular point of failure, it's when a boy loses a male role model in his life.
Sure.
Loses dad because dad abandons him, divorce, 100%. Incarceration. 70% of men, 70% of men in prison had no male role model. Literally none. Not a coach, not a teacher. And so there's all sorts of things we can do. And that's the good news is there's a lot of solutions. The first is, and this is Richard Reeves' idea, redshirting boys. The boys should start school a year later because a 17-year-old boy is basically a 16-year-old girl. And so start them a year later. They mature later sexually, emotionally, mentally. Get more men, try and attract more men into the education field. Because it's natural that a teacher is going to champion the person that reminds him or her of him or herself.
Right.
And when we think about the role model that schools want from students, it's someone. Remember that kid in in high school or junior high school that had their notebook organized by color and distributed the learning, the study, and was really organized, showed up before school. That's typically a girl. Mm-hmm. And the attributes that come easier to girls are what we have trained school teachers and the education system to embrace and reward. So we need more men. About 90%, there are more per capita female fighter pilots than there are male kindergarten teachers. And it's about 90-10 in primary school, and in high school, it's about 70-30. So more men. I think we need more opportunities for young people to meet, fall in love, establish romantic relationships. I'm a big fan of national service. Yeah, I think we need more vocational programming. Remember, Rick, when we were in high school, we had an auto shop, metal shop, and wood shop.
Hell yeah.
And guess what? Those guys, and it was mostly guys, but there was some girls. They went on to make decent livings as mechanics, and they could walk into a construction site. Yeah. And guess what? Anyone who's renovating a home knows that anyone who knows anything about plumbing or electrician makes 6 figures kind of year 2 or 3. These are good jobs. And instead, we've created this gestalt in our society where if a kid doesn't go to Yale and end up at Google, you have failed as a parent, and your son has failed. So we need more vocational programming, and we need a tax policy, more opportunity, a tax policy that helps younger people afford to buy a house and have kids and establish bonds. And we need more economically and emotionally viable, not only young people, but especially more economically and emotionally viable young men. And then just to bite the hand that feeds me, universities in general should lose their tax-free status if they do not grow their freshman seats faster than population when they're sitting on endowments over $1 billion.
I think that's absolutely right.
We have decided in academia that we're not public servants, that we're Birkin bags. And we've instituted this artificial scarcity where Harvard, that sits on $54 billion, decides they can't have a bigger freshman class than 1,500 kids. And so when I applied to UCLA, the admittance rate was 76%. This year, I think it's going to be 9%, which means they don't have the bandwidth to take chances on kids like, I don't know. Rick, were you remarkable? I wasn't at 17.
Look, I was brilliant, but lazy. I was
I was one of those. I was lazy.
Yeah, I was. I was very smart, but I was disorganized. I was a teenage guy. I was
right.
disorganized.
You were a boy.
I was a boy.
Yeah.
I was very, very smart, but that didn't mean I had great grades because I didn't. I tested well, and I got into honors programs and whatnot. But I was from an upper middle class family, and
Yeah.
and I had a speed bump in my early life. What you mentioned a minute ago about male role models when you lose a parent. When I was 14, my dad was in a very, very severe car accident. He was hit by a drunk driver, in and out of a coma for like 3 years. Never really fully recovered, but it like sucked this thing out of my life. But I was fortunate. I had uncles and cousins and his business partners and all these other people that became male role models for me during that period. And if you lose something like that, it is, I think, devastating. But that idea that boys get held to this standard now, I think it's gotten much worse than it was kind of expected when we were in high school. Like, guys are fuck ups. They're going to do what they're going to do until they stop doing, young guy shit. But yeah, it really is like there really is that differential. But again, I cared about things I cared about in school, and it was like one of those A's and F's guys. So one of the things I wanted to bridge to here, and
Let me just press pause
yeah.
there. I didn't know that about you, Rick. So your father was in and out of a coma from when you were from 14
he was
to
in a
17?
he was in a full coma for a year and 2 months, and then in and out of several induced comas because he had 4 brain surgeries and multiple other I haven't really talked about it much. Multiple other surgery. I mean, he shockingly, if this was Dungeons and Dragons, his constitution is a 20. He was like the toughest motherfucker you ever met in recovery. So, but yeah, it shaped me a lot. But I look at that like, if I had not had like literally his business partners and my uncles and everybody else like flooded the zone with male role models and support.
That's wonderful.
Which, I don't wish it on anybody, but it was better than the other possibilities.
Well, I'm sorry. First off, I'm very sorry. I can see you get emotional about it.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: the biggest solution is that if we want better men in this world, we need to do what the men in your life did. They were better men, and that is, and unfortunately, the Catholic Church and Michael Jackson have fucked it up for all of us. There are so many men out there that have love to give, and are afraid to express concern for young men for fear they'll be suspected of something else.
Sure.
And here's the thing. There are young men who need men in their lives everywhere. You don't have to look very far. Your friend's son who won't listen to his parents, your nanny's son who is struggling and sitting at home and vaping. There are so many young men desperate for other men to get involved in their lives. And I've always thought I'm thinking a lot about masculinity and how we form sort of a more modern form of it. I think the greatest expression of masculinity is to become irrationally passionate about the well-being of a child that isn't yours. I think that's when you say to the world, I have my shit so together that I can not only take care of the people in my life, but I can get involved in the well-being of another child that's struggling. I'm trying to do this right now. I have a cousin. I have a cousin who passed away from COVID, and then his wife committed suicide, and the son, is 11, and so we're all trying to rally around this kid and figure out how we can get more involved in his life. But you saw this firsthand. You had all these wonderful men step into that void.
Yep.
And did your father survive that?
He did. And, he and my mom just got back from spending like 2 months hiking in Alaska, Oh,
that's wonderful.
And there's always been some overhang from the traumatic brain injury, but
sure.
He's 80 years old and still spry as can be. And,
and going
and
to
tough
Alaska
as nails.
with his wife.
Yeah. They drove their gigantic land yacht RV to Alaska and went hiking for a couple of months. God bless, But I think you're right that modeling in society that is disappearing though in some ways because kids like have grown up in the social media bubble now. And I feel like I'm not trying to be like the 60-year-old fogey here, but I feel like the social media bubble is breaking kids in ways that are even more pernicious than society is. And I think you've been one of the leaders of basically calling out the big social media companies for the harm they cause to young women when it comes to Insta. and to young men as well. And so, if you were President Galloway the first day of your administration, what happens to the social media companies that are playing these games, because they declaim any responsibility for any emotional or physical harm that they end up causing?
Sure, you remove 230 protection from any
Mm-hmm.
content that's elevated algorithmically, because the moment, their argument is we're just a bulletin board and we can't control what people put on the
Right.
bulletin board.
Yeah,
But
people
if
walk up and
you're
look.
But if you're taking that bulletin board and finding the most controversial content, even if it's harmful to people, and you're making 1 million copies and then distributing across all other billboards, you're now a media company and you're responsible for that content. And if we started distributing content that increased the ad volume on this podcast, and it was shown to have a direct relationship that resulted in suicidal ideation and self-harm, we would be in a lot of trouble. Because we're not protected by 230. So the first is removal of 230 protections for content that's algorithmically elevated. That's not to say the dissenter's voice isn't important. If you want to talk about anti-vax, fine. If you want to say the elections were stolen, fine. But they shouldn't be elevating that content because it polarizes us. They shouldn't be giving it more sunlight than it deserves. 2, antitrust. We just need to oxygenate the economy with more great tech startups. The moment YouTube is forced to spin from Google, they decide to start their own text-based search company, and then Google decides to start their own video-based search company, and YouTube gets better at not radicalizing young men because P&G has more choices in terms of where they advertise and can force more ethical common standards. So a breakup, a removal of Section 230, and then finally, I would age gate social media. I don't think there's any reason for any girl under the age of 16 be on Instagram. I think Instagram begins from a place of perversion. I think an algorithm that encourages a 15-year-old girl to pose in provocative clothing and sexualize herself such that her peers and strange men all over the world can evaluate her is just perverted, full stop. And we age gate alcohol, the military, pornography, driving. Why on earth would we not age gate something that is shown to have a direct correlation with an increase in self-harm and suicidal ideation? So antitrust, age gating, and removal of Section 230 protections.
So the big algorithmic monster, and you've also talked about this a lot, and it's something that I do not have it on my devices. I have it on. I've had it on one burner one time just to go and dive in. Is TikTok, and you've talked a lot about how TikTok is essentially an adjunct of Chinese international, if not propaganda, then persuasion. And why is TikTok so dangerous in your mind? And I agree with you on it. I just want people to hear, because I'm not as articulate at talking about how it's driving behavior as you've been.
So first off, let me acknowledge it's amazing. And I think the people, the shareholders and the employees of TikTok deserve to be incredibly wealthy. And let me reverse it. Say that we had TikTok was American owned, and kids in China were spending more time on, let's call it TikTok US, than they were on all other media combined, which is what's happening in the US. People under the age of 25 are now spending more time on TikTok than all streaming networks and traditional media combined.
Astounding.
And the security apparatus in the United States had a much tighter relationship with tech companies, where basically they did whatever we wanted. There was no discussion around free speech or separation between state and private enterprise. Wouldn't we be stupid not to put our thumb on the scale of pro-American content and anti-Chinese content and raise a generation of Chinese civic, military, and nonprofit leaders that just felt a little bit shittier about China and a little bit better about America? I think that is happening every minute of every day in China. I think in America with TikTok, they have implanted a neural jack into the wet matter of American youth. And in my opinion, they would be stupid not to algorithmically elevate content that positions China in a positive light and depositions America in a negative light. They would just be stupid not to be doing this. So the question is, in an asymmetric relationship where they won't even let our media companies into the nation, should we let something this ascendant and this powerful run unfettered in the United States? It's just insane to me. And the thing is, people our generation, the people making these decisions, don't recognize this is the equivalent of the CCP owning NBC, ABC, CBS, Disney, Hulu, Amazon Prime. That is the amount of hours that young people are spending on TikTok. If all of those entities were owned by the CCP, would we be down with that?
Yeah, I think thank you for getting to that so succinctly, because it is like I mean, I see it among uh, you know, my kids' generation and the generation before them now. That there is an obsessive consumption of TikTok content at a speed and intensity and an hours per day. Look, if you let me, if you give me an hour a day of someone's full attention,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I can change the world. You give me an
Mm-hmm.
hour a day of content that's driven a certain way, change the world. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm lucky if I put out an ad and in a 60-second ad, I consider it a success. If, you know, 1 million people view 40 seconds of the ad, I think that's great. And in politics, that's
Mm-hmm.
a home run.
Mm-hmm.
But in TikTok, that's, you know, one high school's worth of kids in a day watching, you know, hours and hours of this content. It is remarkable how powerful the algorithmic lure works on that platform more than anything else I've ever seen. Um,
Yeah, and it's the most ascended tech platform in history. It's the fastest 0 to 1 billion in history. And what's strange about it, or unusual, or different from the other platforms, the other platforms are public, and they will inflate
right.
their numbers because they want their stock price to go up, so they all get wealthier.
Mm-hmm.
TikTok sandbags their numbers.
Right.
I think when the book is written and we get the data on TikTok, we're going to find out it's doing even better than we know. And if my 13-year-old boy had his druthers, he would go into his room, put on diapers, sit on his side, and watch TikTok, and not to even take bathroom breaks. And I got to be honest, I love TikTok. I, I could easily, you know, I could every night take an edible, pop open a couple beers, and watch TikTok for a couple hours, and just watch strange economists from all over the world talk about
Sure.
fascinating things with great graphics. And I would like it spun to US interests or US investors, or have their service hosted here. Because also, I'd like to see the people there get really wealthy. I think it's an incredible service. I
Mm-hmm.
believe in capitalism. I actually believe
Same.
I believe in a mutually beneficial economic relationship with China. I think one of the worst things that could happen to the world is that the two largest economies don't get along. The biggest tax cut in the history of the world would be if US and China got
Mm-hmm.
along better. It's a great peanut butter and chocolate combination when we're getting along. But when
Yeah.
we're not, it raises the prices of everything on everybody. So I would like to see a solution to this. But as it stands now, TikTok is a defense threat. And look at the rise of social media, look at the rise of TikTok, and look at how young people feel about America. There's an inverse correlation.
I think that that's exactly right. And I mean, I look, and we see the radicalization pipeline that is run through all the other excellent social media platforms. And now that, you know, Elon is turning Twitter into whatever the hell he's transforming it into, the radicalization pipeline for young men gives them a place to go, and it gives them emotional support and excuses and reasons to, you know, direct those youthful passions and energies into some very bad shit.
Mm-hmm.
And with Elon, I mean, I don't even, that's like an unsolvable problem right now. You've got the richest man in the world who should be like doing the important things he should be doing, building an EV, you know, infrastructure. Awesome. Let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
Space. Let's do it. But like the degree to which he has turned Twitter in upside down. I mean, what the hell is broken in Elon's brain? This is a question I ponder a lot.
Yeah, it was so funny, Rick. I was about to say, like, what are your thoughts on Elon? It's hard for me to read the label from inside of the bottle. I am triggered by Elon Musk. Yeah, he's called me names, which isn't that
Sure.
big a deal on Twitter, but I find one of the most disappointing things about what I'll call the tech masters of the universe is that the
Mm-hmm.
most loyal Americans are the ones who've invested the most veterans.
Yeah.
But what I don't get is the ones that shitpost America the most in terms of their power and what they say about America are the most fortunate.
Sure.
And that is, if you look at a map and you go up the West Coast and you start in San Diego and you see Qualcomm, and you go to LA and you see Snap and SpaceX, and you keep going north and you get to Meta and Salesforce, and you keep going north and you get to Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
and you get to Microsoft, and then you hit the Canadian border
Right.
And it stops until you get to Vancouver, and there's one company, Lululemon, worth more than 10 billion. And then you go south of the border, and you don't hit another company worth over a billion or 10 billion until you get to
Timex.
Mercado Libre in Buenos
Mercado Libre,
Aires.
okay. Yeah.
And it's like none of these guys even acknowledge that maybe it has something to do with America. And maybe they should be a little less disparaging of America. As it relates to Elon, a guy who spreads homophobic conspiracy theory, a guy who says blatantly anti-Semitic things, a guy who has 11 kids and isn't living with any of them. And I don't like to insult people on their personal. I've had personal failings.
Sure.
But 11 kids and none of them live with him. It's just, is this the role model we want for young men? And the thing that scares me about raising boys is, masculinity. They think of Trump or Elon Musk or God
Joe
forbid,
Rogan
Putin.
Yeah,
it's just sort of, and it comes back to, Musk to me is just a terrible role model for young men. And it's incredibly disappointing to me that these guys who are so blessed to be American,
right?
And people say he can't control himself. And ask him about China. He's very measured and thoughtful.
Oh, he's very careful about China.
Because, but in a nation where there's freedom of speech and it's polarized and you get, more likes, and there's a certain group of people who've gone very red pill, he'll say very incendiary things about people and it goes back to this masculinity thing. I think on the far right, they have conflated masculinity with cruelty. And on the far left,
for sure,
we've conflated masculinity with femininity. If you ask people on the far left, what's the role model for masculinity, they kind of don't have an answer, and they'll say, act more like a woman. And that's not productive.
That's
either.
not it. That's not it. No, it's, I feel like there's some weird, there's a weird culture inside the right for young men right now that does welcome them. And it merges with the whole video game stuff. It merges with a lot of the, junior shit posting behavior. And when they see a guy like Elon or a guy like David Sachs or whoever, cheerleading Russia or doing the anti-Semitic stuff, at first it's like, haha, it's a joke, it's a prank. Look at the normies getting triggered. But then it becomes sort of their normative behavior, like their regular behavioral set. I think that's where and look, there's no solution to Elon except Elon. He's going to either burn out or grow the fuck up maybe someday. But I see Twitter, the altered Twitter has now become the alt-right part 2. They've really made a resurgence in, and there's no moderation. And he really is it's a strange exception, because any publicly held company by now, he'd be off the board. He'd be out the door in 30 seconds with this kind of shit. But he's got a $44 billion toy and he's going to run it into the ground, I guess.
But that's a key point. And that is, men, especially young men, need guardrails. And greatness is in the agency of others. And the corporate governance structure is that we have boards of directors that are supposed to be fiduciaries for not only shareholders, but for employees and for the Commonwealth. And if you think about the guardrails set up in government, it's such that there's checks and balances everywhere.
Sure.
And I think one of the unfortunate manifestations or externalities of income inequality is that you can have one individual spend $44 billion on a company, which made no sense. He has no board of directors.
Right.
He can call his coworkers sex criminals, and he
Right.
can just sick hundreds of lawyers after them. He cannot pay them their severance that they're legally obligated to. I have friends at Twitter who were fired who can't even find someone to return their calls about their COBRA extension for their health insurance.
Christ. And
his attitude is, I have so many lawyers, I have so much money, it doesn't matter. I'm bulletproof. I'm bulletproof. And this is where it's the age-old adage: power corrupts. And should we have, and in a capitalist society, money equals power.
Right.
And should we be in a situation where an individual can buy a $44 billion media company that's very influential and have no guardrails because he doesn't need them because he has so much fucking money?
This is a postmodern problem. And a friend of mine recently went back. He was doing some research on a book about the antitrust movement in the turn of the last century, in the between the 19th and 20th, and he had hoped to make like a compelling case that you could do a sweeping set of antitrust stuff with tech and a lot of the other vertically integrated companies in the country, and he came away with it like, there are more lawyers per capita working for Meta right now than there were lawyers per capita in the country during the last antitrust roll-up in the 100 years ago or 120 years ago. It's like you'll get lawyered to death on all these problems. I mean,
we've been overrun. I mean,
yeah.
There are more. I mean, think of it this way: there are more people. The number of PR comms people, that is, and I'm sure you hear from them. Do you want to hear? Do you want to hear the head of Instagram's vision for whatever? I get these calls all day long.
Oh, every day. Oh, for sure.
Or I'll hear the CEO of Uber's in town and wants to share his vision of technology with you. And the wonderful thing about, I don't consider myself a journalist, and I'm not being. This isn't bravado. I'm like, I don't want to hang out with people who brighten up a room by leaving it. I have no desire to meet with these people.
Right.
None whatsoever. And they say, and I'm worried that if I meet with them, this is what happens. They're likable. I'll meet them. I'll like them, and I'll stop speaking my mind. And they say, well, you have an obligation with me. I don't have an obligation to meet with these folks, but you're dealing with the PR comms position has gone up sixfold. There's six times as many PR comms people over the last 20 years in big tech. That job has grown 6x. The number of journalists in America over the last 30 years has been cut in half.
Oh, yeah.
So the ratio of bullshit spin to journalism has gone the wrong way 12x. And it's even worse when you talk about lobbyists. There are more full-time lobbyists working just for Amazon living in Washington, D.C. than there are sitting U.S. senators.
Yep.
So we've been, when I was talking to Senator Klobuchar and I expressed some frustration at how her antitrust legislation has not gone through, she's like, Scott, I got a staff of 60 people. I can maybe put a dozen, maybe 24 on any one issue, including antitrust. She's like, Google can throw 100 lawyers at this and muck it up. And their go-to is they pretend to be concerned. These are big problems. Regulate us. For God's sake, stop me before I kill again. And then wink, wink, they deploy an army of super thoughtful, super intelligent, super credentialed, super connected, super well-informed lobbyists who just basically say to a system that's based on getting reelected and and you know this, but you're going to forget more about this than I'm going to know. Getting reelected is directly correlated to how much money you raise.
100%.
It's like, we like your vision for capitalism and think it should be free market, Senator. We would like to get involved in your campaign and be supportive. And how do you feel about this antitrust legislation? Well, I have some concerns. Boom, here's 100,000. I mean, it's just something's got to change because it does feel like DC's has really been overrun.
It was always a lavishly corrupt city, and when I was a young man, worked in the ancient Bush administration, Bush 41 administration. I worked for the Defense Department. I worked for Dick Cheney when he was Secretary of Defense, and we used to deal with defense contractors and lobbyists. And I was a young guy, but you could see sort of they were always, even then, sort of like stepping carefully. They didn't want to cross certain ethical lines, and now they don't. It's just it's the Wild West. I mean, people are just like, hey, would your chief of staff like a job with us after this for $450 a year? And they make it incredibly blunt now, and it's hard to overcome that. So, well, Scott Galloway, listen, I appreciate you coming on the enemies list today, brother. It has been a terrific conversation, as I had hoped, and I'm grateful for your wisdom, and look forward to having you back again soon.
Rick, I mean this sincerely. I just love hanging and rolling with you. I find you to be courageous, unafraid, and I realize that's redundant. And I just love. I get the sense that you may get it wrong, but your heart's in the right place, and you're always speaking what you think. So right on, brother.
Thank you, my friend. That's a high compliment to me, because if I fuck up, I say so, and I try to keep. I try to keep things as close to reality. I try not to be a different personality on social media or on TV than I really am in real life. I try to have very little delta in any of those things. I am who and what I am. So I appreciate you saying that. I really do. So
all right, thanks again.
All right, thanks, Scott.